How does a 15-year-old boy, a teenager still mourning the sudden, catastrophic loss of his father to a global pandemic, even begin to conceptualize, let alone build, a real estate empire? This question sits at the very heart of the Trump dynasty's origin story. In an era defined by overwhelming tragedy, the dual specters of the First World War, and the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, most young men his age would be focused on mere survival, on navigating the grief that had just shattered their family. But Fred Trump was not most young men. In the working class, immigrant-filled neighborhoods of Queens, New York, a relentless, calculating ambition was already taking root. This wasn't a story of inherited privilege in the traditional sense. It was a story of a void, a sudden vacuum of power within the family, and a young man who, driven by a combination of necessity and a prodigious innate drive, stepped into that void with an intensity that would define his entire life and ultimately shape the 21st century. The Trump family's American story, like so many others, began with a rejection of the old world and a gamble on the new. It started with Friedrich Trump, a German immigrant from the small town of Kolstadt, who fled Bavaria in 1885, allegedly to escape mandatory military service. He was not a man of grand ideas, but a man with a keen instinct for where money was flowing. He followed the waves of desperate optimism, first to the American West, and then north to the Klondike Gold Rush. There, in the muddy, frozen boomtowns, he built his first small fortune not by panning for gold, but by servicing the miners running restaurants, taverns, and hotels that were rumored to include brothels. He returned to Queens, New York, a wealthy man, only to have his life and the family's trajectory violently altered. In 1918, the global pandemic of the Spanish flu, a virus that respected neither wealth nor status. When World War II erupted, pulling the United States into a global conflict, Fred Trump did not see chaos. He saw an unprecedented business opportunity. The nation's economy was retooling for total war, and the government was pouring billions of dollars into building the arsenal of democracy. Fred Trump, now a seasoned and wealthy builder, pivoted his entire business model. He temporarily shifted from building private homes for the middle class to building federally subsidized housing for the U.S. government. His new clients were soldiers, sailors, and factory workers who needed to be housed near critical military and industrial sites. Using the immense financial power of the Federal Housing Administration (FHA), a New Deal agency whose loan programs were now supercharged by the war effort, he secured massive government-backed loans. With this federal backing, he built sprawling, utilitarian barracks and garden-style apartment complexes for U.S. Navy personnel and shipyard workers near major naval shipyards in Norfolk, Virginia, and Chester, Pennsylvania. This wartime work was transformative for his business, taking him from a local Queens developer to a major, multi-state government contractor. This was not, in any conventional sense, private enterprise. It was not the high-risk, free-market capitalism of his spec house days. This was a business model built almost entirely on public money. political connections, and federal loan guarantees. The FHA loans effectively removed all of his personal financial risk. The government guaranteed the loans, and the war effort guaranteed the tenants. Fred Trump simply had to build, and he was guaranteed a profit. He learned an invaluable lesson that would define his entire career. The fastest and safest path to immense wealth was not by risking your own capital, but by mastering the system of government subsidies and contracts. After the war ended in 1945, the boom returned, bigger and more explosive than ever. Millions of soldiers returned home, sparking the GI Bill, the marriage boom, and the baby boom. This created a housing crisis of unprecedented scale. America, particularly New York City, was desperate for affordable places to live. Fred Trump, now armed with a massive reserve of capital from his wartime contracts and, more importantly, with deep connections within the FHA bureaucracy, was perfectly positioned to capitalize on this crisis. He used his FHA connections to secure enormous, low-interest, government-backed loans to build massive middle-class apartment complexes throughout the outer boroughs. He quickly became the undisputed king of the outer boroughs, while other developers fought for the prestige of Manhattan. Fred Trump dominated the working-class landscapes of Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island. He didn't build elegant, architecturally significant buildings. He built vast, sprawling apartment complexes that were like self-contained cities. Projects like Beach Haven in Coney Island and, later, Trump Village were not single buildings but massive collections of sturdy, red brick towers that housed thousands of families. He was arguably the most powerful and prolific developer in New York City who wasn't building skyscrapers. These were not luxury buildings. They were the very definition of no-frills. Utilitarian housing. They were sturdy, monotonous, red brick towers built on a massive scale with a focus on speed, cost efficiency, and density. His tenants were the backbone of New York's post-war middle class. The teachers, the police officers, the firefighters, and the city workers. He provided clean, safe, and thanks to government subsidies, affordable housing. In return, he received a steady, reliable, and government-guaranteed stream of income. He was a landlord to tens of thousands, a dominant force in the lives of the outer boroughs, and a man who understood the mechanics of middle-class housing better than anyone. Fred Trump's true, lasting genius was not just in construction, not in his ability to pour concrete or lay bricks efficiently. His real talent, the one that truly separated him from his competitors, was his absolute mastery of the insider game. He understood, at a granular level, that in a heavily regulated city like New York, the most valuable tool was not a hammer, but political influence. He dedicated himself to mastering the labyrinthine, patronage-fueled world of politics, subsidies, and zoning. He built deep, powerful, and mutually beneficial ties with the Brooklyn Democratic political machine, the dominant, old-school political power in the borough. He was a creature of this system. He gave generously, making political contributions to the right candidates, attending the right political dinners, and cultivating a network of loyalty among city council members, borough presidents, and party bosses. He made himself indispensable to the men who ran the city. ensuring he was seen as a friend and a reliable partner. In return for this loyalty, this steady stream of quiet contributions and public support, he got what he needed. The political machine delivered for him. When he needed a piece of land rezoned from industrial to residential, it was done. When he needed a street demapped or a sewer line extended for one of his massive projects, it was approved. Most importantly, his political friends helped him navigate the state and federal bureaucracies, ensuring his applications for lucrative FHA loans and, later, New York State Mitchell-Lama housing subsidies were always moved to the top of the pile. He knew, fundamentally, how the system truly worked. It ran on favors, access, and patronage. In 1973, just as his son Donald was rising in the company, the U.S. government hit Fred Trump and his company, Trump Management, with a massive and damning civil rights lawsuit. The charge was not financial, but moral and legal, a systematic, company-wide violation of the Fair Housing Act of 1968. The lawsuit, filed by the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, was one of the largest and most high-profile housing discrimination cases of its time, and it struck at the very heart of the empire Fred Trump had built. The Department of Justice, under the Nixon administration, alleged a long-standing and systematic pattern of racial discrimination across Trump's vast portfolio of buildings. The evidence, gathered by investigators and civil rights groups, was specific and shocking. It included testimony from former Trump building superintendents, who claimed they had been instructed to steer black applicants away. Most famously, the government alleged that rental applications were secretly marked with codes, including the letter C for colored, to ensure they would be screened out and denied. To confirm this pattern, the DOJ and the New York City Human Rights Commission sent testers to Trump properties. This was a classic investigative technique. A white tester and a black tester, with identical and excellent financial qualifications, would apply for the same apartment on the same day. The results, according to the lawsuit, were stark and consistent. The white testers would be told apartments were available and would be offered leases. The black testers, applying for the very same units, would be told that, unfortunately, nothing was available. This evidence formed the core of the government's case that Trump management was actively engineering a color line. Fred Trump's reaction to this devastating federal lawsuit was defining. He did not settle quietly. He did not apologize. He did not even attempt to negotiate. Instead, he reacted with explosive, indignant rage. He viewed the lawsuit not as a legitimate grievance, but as a personal, political, and ungrateful attack by the very government he had partnered with for decades. His first and most important decision was to hire the single most aggressive, feared, and notorious lawyer in New York City, Roy Cohn. This was the same Roy Cohn who had been Senator Joseph McCarthy's chief counsel during the anti-communist Red Scare, a man whose reputation was built on scorched-earth tactics, personal smears, and a total lack of ethical restraint. Their strategy, devised by the brilliant and ruthless mind of Roy Cohn, was revolutionary in its audacity and would become the foundational text of the Trump family playbook. The strategy had three parts. First, never admit guilt. Second, attack the attackers. Third, countersue with overwhelming force. Cohn and the Trumps, with 27-year-old Donald now serving as the public face of the defense, didn't just defend the case. They immediately filed a $100 million countersuit against the U.S. government, accusing the Department of Justice of defamation, harassment, and reverse discrimination for trying to force them to rent to welfare recipients. They held aggressive, defiant press conferences, with Roy Cohn and Donald Trump standing side by side, accusing the government of a Gestapo-like shakedown. This was not a legal strategy. It was a public relations war. The countersuit was a farce, and it was quickly dismissed by a judge. But it served its purpose. It changed the headlines from Trump sued for racism to Trump sues government for $100 million. It was a lesson in media manipulation and aggressive counterpunching that Donald Trump, in particular, would never forget. The Trumps ultimately settled the case 2 years later, signing a consent decree that required them to, among other things, actively advertise vacancies to minority communities. But they did so without ever admitting guilt. This was not the first time Fred Trump's properties had been associated with racial discrimination. 2 decades earlier, in the early 1950s, one of Fred's tenants at his massive Beach Haven complex in Brooklyn was one of the most iconic figures in American history, the folk music legend and political activist Woody Guthrie. Guthrie, the Dust Bowl balladeer who wrote This Land Is Your Land, was a fierce advocate for working-class people and racial integration. Woody Guthrie lived in Trump's Beach Haven complex for 2 years and was, by his own account, utterly disgusted by the racial discrimination he witnessed there. He saw the complex as a whited sepulchre, a clean, brick facade hiding a deep-seated bigotry. He saw how his black friends were treated when they came to visit, and how the tenant population was kept artificially, deliberately white. He felt implicated, living in a subsidized complex that, in his view, used public money to create a white enclave. He was so angered by what he saw that he channeled his rage into his art, writing scathing, accusatory lyrics in his personal notebook. These lyrics, which were not discovered until decades after his death, were a direct indictment of his landlord. He wrote, "I suppose old man Trump knows just how much racial hate he's stirred up in the blood-red heart of his housing project." It was a damning, poetic accusation from one of the most powerful voices of the 20th century, confirming that the color line at Trump Properties was visible to its own tenants long before the government ever sued. How did Donald Trump make the leap from his father's Outerboroughs empire to the glittering, high-stakes world of Manhattan real estate? The myth, a story he cultivated himself, was that he did it on his own, with a small loan of $1 million from his father. This narrative of the self-made man, who took a modest stake and turned it into a global brand, was central to his public persona. It was a story of genius, grit, and singular vision, a tale of him conquering a new, tougher world that his father had always avoided. The reality of Donald Trump's entry into Manhattan was far deeper and more complex. Fred Trump's support was not a simple $1 million loan. His father's financial backing was total and absolute. Fred didn't just give him a loan. He co-signed on the massive nine-figure bank loans that were necessary for these Manhattan-scale projects. He used his entire outer borough empire, worth hundreds of millions of dollars, as a financial backstop, guaranteeing his son's debts. The banks weren't lending to the unknown 20-something Donald. They were lending to Fred Trump, one of the safest and wealthiest developers in New York. Furthermore, Fred also used his most valuable asset, his political machine. He introduced Donald to his own network of fixers, politicians, and power brokers. It was Fred's deep connections to the Brooklyn Democratic machine, which in turn had deep connections to the city's government, that helped Donald secure the complex and controversial package of tax abatements, zoning permits, and political approvals needed to build his first major project, the transformation of the failing Commodore Hotel into the Grand Hyatt. It was a deal built on Fred's money and Fred's connections. Fred Trump had two sons, and the company's succession plan was a source of great personal turmoil. The eldest son, Fred Jr., was meant to inherit the empire. He was named after his father and, by tradition, was the heir apparent. But it quickly became clear to Fred Sr. that his namesake was not the killer that he wanted. Fred Jr. was, by all accounts, the opposite of his father. He was easygoing, gentle, pilots, and had little interest in the ruthless, grinding, 24/7's world of his father's business. Fred Jr. wanted to be a pilot, a passion he pursued by joining TWA. His father, Fred Sr., saw this as a profound betrayal and a sign of weakness. He relentlessly mocked his eldest son for being a bus driver in the sky. He derided him for not being tough enough, for lacking the killer instinct, and for being too nice. This constant, brutal psychological pressure from his father is widely cited by family members as a major contributing factor in Fred Jr.'s subsequent decline into alcoholism. He died a premature, tragic death in 1981 at the age of 42. Fred Sr. saw the killer instinct he craved in his second son, Donald. Where Fred Jr. was soft, Donald was hard. Where Fred Jr. was hesitant, Donald was brash and confident. Fred Sr. recognized his own predatory business instincts in his younger son and began to meticulously groom him in his own tough-as-nails image. He sent Donald to a military academy to instill discipline, then to the Wharton School for a business education. He brought him into the family business, teaching him to be a king, to be tough, to fight, and to win. He actively shaped the man who would take over the empire. Fred Trump's entire 70-year career was not just a series of transactions. It was the creation of a playbook, a set of immutable rules for business and for life, which he drilled into his chosen successor. Rule 1 was the most fundamental. Use government funds, public subsidies, and other people's money OPM to build your fortune. Minimize your own personal risk by getting the government to guarantee your loans and subsidize your projects. Why risk your own capital when you can build an empire with public money? Rule 2 was the Roy Cohn Doctrine, learned and perfected during the fair housing lawsuit. Fight every single battle, no matter how small. Never admit defeat, never apologize, and never, ever settle unless you can spin it as a victory. The moment you are attacked, you do not defend. You counterattack immediately, aggressively, and with overwhelming, disproportionate force. The goal is not to win in court, but to intimidate, bankrupt, and silence your opponent in the court of public opinion. Rule 3 was the summation of his entire life's philosophy. The lesson he hammered into Donald, and for which he had disdained Fred Jr. Win at all costs. Business was not a transaction. It was a war. Your competitors were enemies. Your tenants were sources of revenue. And the legal system was a tool to be wielded. This ruthless, zero-sum philosophy, forged in the hyper-competitive, politically corrupt world of the outer boroughs, became the unshakable foundation for the entire Trump organization and its future leader. In the 1990s, the formidable, relentless, and calculating mind of Fred Trump, the mind that had built an empire from nothing and remembered every slight and every contract, began to decline. He was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, a cruel, slow-moving disease that robs its victims of their memories and their very identity. As the patriarch's grip on reality and on his business affairs began to slip, a new, internal, and bitter dynamic emerged. As his health failed and his memory faded, a power struggle began within the family. His children, who had been raised in a hyper-competitive environment, vied for control of the vast, aging, and incredibly valuable real estate empire he had built. The question of inheritance, of who would get what, and who would ultimately control the legacy of E. Trump and Son, became a source of intense, internal family conflict that would lead to lawsuits and permanent rifts. In 2018, nearly 2 decades after Fred Trump's death in 1999, a groundbreaking 15-0-word investigative report by the New York Times revealed the hidden financial history of how Fred Trump had passed his immense wealth to his children. The investigation, based on hundreds of thousands of confidential tax returns and financial records, painted a picture that was starkly at odds with the million-dollar loan myth. The Times investigation alleged a decades-long pattern of complex and, in their words, dubious and outright fraudulent tax schemes. It wasn't just millions. It was an empire worth, at the time, hundreds of millions of dollars that was transferred from the father to his children. This, the Times alleged, was done while systematically and creatively avoiding the massive estate and gift taxes that such a transfer would normally require. These methods, according to the Times report, were complex and sophisticated. They allegedly included the creation of sham corporations, like a company called All County Building Supply and Maintenance, which was owned by the Trump children. This company would allegedly buy supplies for Fred's buildings, with Fred's company paying the bill. In reality, All County was just a shell, and these purchases were just a tax-free way to pass millions of dollars from Fred to his children, disguised as business expenses. Other methods allegedly included systematically and dramatically undervaluing his properties on tax returns to avoid hundreds of millions of dollars in inheritance taxes. Fred Trump's ultimate, lasting legacy is not his brick-and-mortar buildings. The sprawling, functional, but unremarkable brick towers he built in Brooklyn and Queens are aging. They are monuments to a specific, post-war era of urban development, but they are not, in themselves, world-changing. His true, and far more consequential. Legacy is the successor he created. His masterpiece was not a building. It was the son he meticulously groomed, funded, and armed with his own personal philosophy. He passed down 3 essential tools that made his son's trajectory possible. He passed down his capital, the hundreds of millions of dollars, as the Times alleged, that provided the financial foundation for every deal. He passed down his political playbook, the mastery of the insider game, the leveraging of connections, and the art of the subsidy, and, most importantly, he passed down his win-at-all-costs worldview, the killer instinct, and the Roy Cohn-inspired tactics of total, relentless, and aggressive warfare against all perceived enemies. The architect of a dynasty, Fred Trump, never lived in the White House. He was a creature of Queens and Brooklyn, a man who, by all accounts, was most comfortable in his pickup truck, checking on his building sites. He never sought the global spotlight, but he was, in a very real and direct way, the man who made a president. The political, financial, and psychological blueprint he created over a 70-year career was the essential, indispensable foundation upon which his son would launch the most improbable political take over in modern American history.